And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. For in them is filled up the wrath of God. And I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works. Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy, for all nations shall come and worship before thee. For thy judgments are made manifest. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials, full of the wrath of God, who liveth forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God, and from his power. And no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Hello everyone, welcome back to the reading of the 7th Vial, book by James Aiken Wylie. He released 2 different versions of this book. One was published in 1848, and this is the revised version. And we're going to really learn this, the real big revision he did. And that's part of this 4th vial in this reading. And today we have a special guest. We have Michael in Germany. Welcome, Michael.
Yeah, hello, dear Brad. Thanks for inviting me. But I think I'm not so special. I'm just the average guy who just wants to improve his English by just listening to you.
Okay, well, yeah, you're definitely my companion in Christ, and a fellow researcher that I really admire, and I'm glad that you're with me and here to embark on the journey into this reading and discussion of this next chapter, which is the 4th vial, the Son of Fire. And it's kind of a long chapter, so this will probably be a 2-hour reading, I would imagine, Michael. So here we go. Chapter 21. We have contemplated the period of judgment that passed over Europe, commencing on the 5th of May, 1789, with the splendid ceremonial of the assembling of the States General at the Palace of Versailles, and terminating on the 18th of June, 1815, with the awful carnage of the field of Waterloo. History has been guilty of an untruth if another period can be found of the same length in which so many dark woes befell the human race. But when the period of judgment came to an end, it was seen that, though the world had suffered much, it had learned nothing. Quote, they blasphemed they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds, unquote. No sooner had the deluge passed over when the ancient landmarks began to be restored. Quote, where is the promise of his coming, unquote, said the men of that time, and concluding that all things would go on as before, they began to make provision accordingly. Absolutism set up the thrones which the revolutionary tempest had overturned. Superstition purified the altars which atheism had profaned. And infidelity, unawed by the display which God had given of his being and his holiness, began again to vent its horrible blasphemies and propagate its shallow and impious dogmas. On the same stage, the same three principles which had already convulsed Europe and deluged it with blood began anew to act with increased activity and energy. For 33 years had God waited for the repentance of men of the papal earth, but they repented not. And now the drama of vengeance is resumed. Quote, "And the fourth angel," Revelation 16:8 and 9, "poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire." Unquote. Upon the sun of this symbolic universe was the fourth vial poured. The effect of the vial was that the sun was shorn of its light, but this obscuration lasted for only a little while, for immediately almost that illuminary shone out again, fiercer than before the vial had been poured upon him, and began to flame in such burning strength that men were scorched with great heat. Let us mark here the progression of the judgment and the widening, according to a certain law, of the sphere of its infliction. The first vial was poured upon the individual men of the papal earth. The second was poured upon one of its leading nations. The third fell upon all of the 10 kingdoms that remained subject to the papacy, the symbolic rivers of the papal world. And now the fourth vial is emptied upon its son. The quote-unquote son is a symbol of established usage in prophecy. It denotes the ruling powers of the world. The same office which the lights of the firmament perform to the earth do kings and statesmen perform to society. And hence, in Scripture, the sun and stars are put to denote these ruling authorities. The quote-unquote son of this symbolic world can mean only the conjoined monarchies or monarchs of papal Europe. We are disposed to find the pouring out of the fourth vial in the Revolution of 1848. These events of that epoch fulfill all the conditions of this vial. The revolution came suddenly. It extended to all the thrones of papal Europe. Its effect was as if, while the luminaries of the papal firmament were shining, the light untroubled, a vial of darkness had been poured upon them, and there followed a sudden night. And not less striking was the fulfillment of the remaining particulars. The symbolic lights, so suddenly and terribly smitten, soon resumed their functions, and, shooting from their lofty spheres more fervid rays than ever, scorched men with intolerable heat, the heat of a political reaction of unparalleled rigor and severity. A deep calm preceded the outbreak of 1848. The Great Revolution, which had so fearfully rocked the thrones and altars of the papal world in the beginning of the century, had retreated to its deep cave, there to slumber profoundly, it was believed, for a very long period, if not forever. The kings were at enmity, and the nations were disposed to cultivate friendly relations and to take from one another pledges of peace. The world, as it said, was too old and too wise ever again to play at the game of war. The expectation of a lengthened period of tranquility was thus confidently entertained. And so far as human foresight could reach, the hope appeared to be well-founded. The generation had not yet passed away who had witnessed the horrors of the last war, and before plunging into a new one, were likely to inquire whether they would derive more profit from it than they had reaped from that which preceded it. The warriors and statesmen were still alive who had sworn to wreath with myrtle and the sword of Waterloo. Excuse me. Let me read that sentence again. The warriors and statesmen were still alive who had sworn to wreath the myrtle and sword of Waterloo. They possessed other stronger guarantees of tranquility. Peace was multiplying her trophies. Commerce was enlarging her field of operation. The intercourse of nations, daily extending, was strengthening the feeling of enmity and the bonds of concord. The press was forming a public opinion strongly adverse to war. In the July of 1847, the profound tranquility of the Western world and the probable continuance of that tranquility were proclaimed from the thrones of England and France on almost the same day. Such was the position of Europe 6 months before the outbreak. That part of the world had for ages been ruled by the twin powers of superstition and force. But now the continental nations had in part loosened themselves from the restraints of superstition. Infidelity had broken that yoke. Force only remained. It was the last bulwark. And if it should give way, no human power could prevent the waters breaking in. Of that order of things, Metternich was the type. He stood between the dynasties and the democracies, the last bulwark which guarded the ever-increasing decrepitude of the one from the ever-growing strength of the other. And he understood his position, hence his memorable words, quote, "After me, the deluge," unquote. Such, we say, was the position of Europe immediately before that unexampled outbreak which took by surprise those only who were unacquainted with the true state of matters, and none shared so deeply in this dangerous ignorance as those who had most at stake, and to whom it was at once a matter of duty and interest to take measures of precaution. The avalanche had gathered and hung trembling on the mountain's brow. But, alas, the dwellers in the plain lived beneath The dwellers in the plain lived beneath in profound security, little dreaming that a single breath might draw down upon them the thundering ruin. The breath stirred, and the avalanche descended. On the 23rd of February, the revolution broke out at Paris, and before the 5th of March, every country lying between the Atlantic and the Vistula had, in a greater or less degree, been revolutionized. Although the outbreak in France had impregnated the whole atmosphere of Europe with the principles of revolution, the effect could not have been more striking. The contagion crossed the Alps and gave additional urgency to demands which had already begun to be made by the Italian principalities for constitutional rights. It passed the Po and penetrated the very stronghold of European despotism. Metternich fled before it, leaving the once powerful empire whose policy he had so long guided a prey to terrible calamities. It descended the Rhine along its entire course, from the mountains of the Black Forest, stirring its dukedoms and electorates into tumult and insurrection. It struck eastward in the very heart of Germany, still producing, whatever it came, the same commotions, popular assemblies, demands, threats, insurrections, skirmishings, all hostile to royal prerogative. The great kingdom of Prussia felt its shock, and, well nigh prostrated, the force of the movement was spent only when it had reached the Russian frontier. Providence had said to it, quote, "Hitherto, but no farther," unquote. And here, accordingly, its progress was arrested. It did not cross the Vistula, for Russia forms no part of the Romish earth, and Providence has reserved this powerful kingdom, it would appear, for other purposes. Such was the extent of the movement. On almost the same day, the various nations inhabiting from the hills of Sicily to the shores of the Baltic met to discuss the same grievances and urge the same demands. They did not act by concert. Nothing had been arranged beforehand. None were more astonished at what was going on than the actors themselves in these scenes. One mighty influence had moved the minds of 100 nations as the mind of one man, and all obeyed a power which everyone felt to be irresistible. Thus suddenly were all the lights of the political firmament smitten, and, as it seemed at the time, extinguished. Let us take a brief survey of the changes which this second and grand development of revolution so speedily achieved. We place ourselves at the spring of 1848. We look for the governments, the laws, the armies which have borne sway in Europe these 1,500 years, and which existed apparently in all their strength when the current year opened, and find that they have been shivered by a tremendous blow and driven away as a chaff before the tempest. Ere the French Revolution was a month old, it had effected the entire change upon the aspect of Europe. These events of centuries were crowded into as many days. One astounding change followed another with a rapidity which dazzled the imagination, and occurrences of yesterday gave place, in the astonishment of men, to that caused by the more surprising intelligence of today, defying the checks of power and transcending the anticipations of even the most sanguine and great movement. Let me get that again here. Repeat that sentence. Defying the checks of power and transcending the anticipations, of even the most sanguine, the great movement went on, gathering momentum as it proceeded and leveling in the dust all the barriers of a venerable despotism. Let us now follow its course and mark its changes. In certain of the Italian principalities, some popular concessions had previously been made. To these, it not only communicated permanency, but it still further enlarged them. It extorted religious freedom from Charles Albert, monarch of Sardinia. It emancipated the duchies lying at the base of the Alps, Modena, Parma, Lucca, and lifted the long prescribed Waldenses to an equality with their countrymen in civil and religious rights. It excited the wealthy province of Lombardy, which, like Issachar of old, seeing that rest was good, and the land pleasant, had crouched down between the two burdens of Rome and Austria to rebel against at least the latter yoke, it gave a new impulse to the War of Independence in Sicily. Above all, it told Pius IX that he could no longer deal in sham reforms and no longer amuse his subjects with verbal concessions and constitutions on paper. It must begin in good earnest the work of reform by bestowing real and substantial privileges on the Roman people. But its greatest achievement awaited the revolution on the east of the Po. Austria had been the keystone in the arc of continental despotism. When Austria fell, the fabric of European feudalism became apparently a mass of crumbling ruin. The vast change which the revolutionary spirit effected on this country may be conceived from the single fact, not to dwell on other particulars, that universal suffrage was established and liberty given for the time to all the subjects of the empire to worship accordingly to their conscience, and that, too, notwithstanding that the power of the aristocracy and the wealth and pride of the Romish hierarchy had continued up till that period to be greater in Austria than in any other country of Europe. North of the Alps, the effects of the Great Revolution were just as palpable as the south of these mountains. It awoke the spirit of the Germans, long repressed, and recalled the memory of their ancient liberties and their past renown. It darted a ray of light between the dark clouds which had long rested above the lands of Huss. It gave a free government to priest-ridden Bavaria. It gave constitutional privileges to the numerous duchies. Am I saying this right? Duchies? What is it, Michael?
Oh, that's, you don't ask a German guy who does not speak American English fluently.
I just wonder, is it duchies? Must be duchies.
Yeah, I know Duke and I know Duchess, but what are duchies? I do not know. I have to look it up.
I would have to look it up too. But I think it has something to do with the hierarchy, right? But anyway, I'll just repeat that sentence. It gave free government to priest-ridden.
Yeah. Actually, it is that the belongings of a duke or duchess. That's what's meant duchies.
Oh,
yeah. So we were so close.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So it is duchies.
So like Duchess, yes.
Like Duchess. Yeah. Okay, Perfect. Thank you. It gave a free government to priest-ridden Bavaria. It gave constitutional privileges to the numerous duchies that girdled the Black Forest, long enthralled by petty tyrants. In the electorates on the Rhine, it produced popular demands, which were instantly followed by popular concessions. In the great empire of Prussia and in the neighboring kingdoms of Hanover and Saxony, it made its power equally felt. In the former kingdom, a momentary indecision of the monarchs served only to render more apparently the force of the movement. In Berlin, barricades arose, blood flowed, and the populace, triumphing over the throne, were able to dictate their own terms. Thus, in the short space of a single month, the pouring out of this vial changed the condition of every country lying between the Straits of Manisa and the shores of the Baltic. It created, in fact, a new Europe. It established in all its countries, by concession at least, the three great bulwarks of civil liberty, namely constitutional government, trial by jury, and the right of public meeting. In the rear of its political changes, it brought likewise vast social and moral meliorations. It rent asunder the chains that bound the press. It abolished the lines of custom houses which Europe was crossed and recrossed in all directions. And it swept away the restrictions employed to fetter the truth, thus giving to the nations an unrestricted commerce, the free diffusion of knowledge, and liberty to read the Bible and enjoy the gospel. Had the revolution stopped at the point it had now reached, it would have accomplished more good for Europe than any similar movement which had preceded it. It embodied all that amount of civil and political freedom which is right that civil society should enjoy. It was so far the passage of Europe from despotism to constitutional liberty. It left room for nothing to come after it on just grounds, either in the way of demands or concessions. All that remained was to turn it to account, and especially to prosecute its moral ends. But here it did not stop. The vial became a vial of judgment to both the kings and the nations. Let us mark with that terrible force. The vial struck the sun. The revolution soon passed the Rubicon, and the terrible fact stared men in the face that it was on an anarchy that Europe was drifting. We speak not of the confusion and misrule into which its little princedoms fell. Its greatest monarchies were breaking up. Its oldest statesmen were nonplussed, means confused. They didn't know what to do in an instant. In its mightiest thrones were rendered powerless. A moral decomposition was going on everywhere. Authority was prostrate. Laws were violated with impunity. And from the Atlantic to the Vistula, kings were little better than captives, and the mob was sovereign. In the train of these political evils came a host of commercial and social mischiefs. The ordinary business of life was a great degree unsuspended. The ordinary business of life was to a great degree suspended, commerce paralyzed, trade and manufactures at a standstill. The exchangers woefully impoverished, the lower classes discontented, and at war with those above them, the upper class terrified and without confidence in the future. The towns swarmed with barricade heroes, the country with rural marauders, and the masses everywhere were ripe with any mischief. What a picture of dislocation and ruin did France then present! That once powerful kingdom, the eldest horn of the beast, and one of the chief agents in the slaughter of the witnesses, was then, as it has been before and since, visited by God for the blood of his saints. Her government was unable to guarantee safety of life and property. Her assembly, instead of grappling vigorously with the evils that surrounded it, was torn by faction and passed its time in indecorous and tumultuary debates. That's indecorous. Indecorous and tumultuary debates. I think indecorous was confusing and perplexed. I'm not sure. I think I looked it up. Let's see. Indecorous. Where was it? Yeah. Not keeping with good taste, improper. Yeah. National bankruptcy was advancing with rapid strides. The expenditure of the monarchy exceeded its income by 2/3 francs, but the loss to the revenue of the Republic for the first was calculated at 20 millions of pounds sterling. The citizens lived amidst perpetual alarms and were harassed by never-ceasing calls to military duty. Fearful rumors and terrible threats distracted the minds of men, which were still further agitated by conspiracies having avowedly for their object the confiscation of all the property in the kingdom and the surrender of the upper and middle classes into the hands of the ruffians and malefactors which infested the country. Turning to Austria, there was seen a gigantic wreck where this magnificent empire once stood. The emperor fled to the Tyrol. Excuse me. Is that a town, Michael? Or Tyrol? What is that? I wonder. I should look that up.
Don't know.
To the Tyrol. The emperor fled to the Tyrol, whether he was followed by a frightened...
Yes. I'm sorry to disturb.
Please, go ahead.
It's been written with an I instead of a Y, so Tyrol, which is a county.
Thank you.
In Austria. It's a county like Nebraska or what else.
Yeah,
it's a
sounds good. Great. The emperor had fled to the Tyrol, where whether he was followed by a frightened herd of archdukes and nobles. The dying embers of Tyrolese royalty were unexpectedly fanned by this mark of royal confidence, and it seemed just possible that the zeal of these mountaineers might bring upon the fallen empire the horrors of a civil war. Vienna was filled with barricades, concessions were demanded, and the same work of confusion commenced in Vienna, which was in progress in Paris. Austria, the successor of the Germanic Caesars, had gathered under her eagle men of every race, the industrious and enterprising Lombard, the acute Illyrian, the stately Hungarian, the meditative German, the persevering Bohemian, and the fiery Pole. She had drawn her riches from the flourishing trade of Lombardy, the waving harvests of Galatia, the rich pastures of Bohemia, and the wealthy mines of Carthenia and Hungary. But the fall of the central authority had set loose all these various nations and dried up all the sources of wealth. The provinces were breaking away from the empire, and Austria exhibited a chaos great in proportion to her former grandeur. In Italy, disorganization had not proceeded to the same length, only because its progress meanwhile was arrested by the war with Austria. But dissensions were rife throughout the peninsula. A sanguinary war raged on the Po, and brought on by the ambition of King Charles Albert, who hoped that Milan would place her icon crown upon his head. The revolting massacre at Naples broke up the ill-omened league between the Pope, Albert of Sardinia, and Ferdinand of Naples, and complicated still further the affairs of Italy. Rome itself became the scene of tumult. The Jesuits, with their famous General Ruthon, were expelled, and though the Pope was still suffered to hold the rank and titles of sovereign of the Roman states, he was completely shorn of the sovereign power. He had the perplexing alternative proposed to him of drawing the sword against those whom he calls his children, or abdicating the throne of the Quernal. If the kings who had compelled to bend their necks to the Gregorys and Hildebrands of the Middle Ages had then looked up, how would they have grimly smiled to see the foot of the Roman mob upon the neck of Pius? I imagine they mean Pius IX. Yes. Thus was the vial poured upon the Son. All over papal Europe, royalty was smitten, suddenly, terribly smitten. Laws were abolished. Armies were forced to flee. Dynasties were sent into exile. The supreme power was in the dust, and the mob was the monarch. The extinction of the Son was not intended by the vial. It would smite him with disastrous eclipse, but that eclipse would soon pass off, and he would reappear, but in such a blaze of fire as to scorch men, quote, and power, unquote. It is said, quote, was given unto him to scorch men with fire, and men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, who hath power over these plagues, unquote. This manifestly implies a resumption of the powers of government, the suspension of which had been the first effect of the vial. But their resumption, not in their natural or usual way, but in some most malign and mischievous mode of working. The sun that usually enlightens and nourishes was now to scorch on those on whom it shone. This can mean only some grievous perversion of all the ends of government, whereby instead of protecting and blessing society, it would blight and destroy it by the exercise of a fearful and cruel tyranny. Instead of light and warmth, this symbolic sun would rain fire upon men. And the event very signally fulfilled the symbol. The revolution of 1848 was followed by the reaction of 1849. The first panic having subsided, the kings and dynasties whom the revolution had chased into exile began to gather heart and to make a stand. They asked whether it were possible to reassemble their armies, confront anarchy, and recover their thrones. The attempt was made, and after many a scene of conflict and carnage, it was successful. Quote, power was given, unquote, to that Son whom the vial had smitten. The battle of order against anarchy began in Paris. After a bloody struggle of 3 days in the streets of its capital, Cavaignac reduced France under the government of the saber. The example thus set was followed in all the countries of Western Europe to which the revolt had extended. Rome was bombarded and, after a heroic defense of 2 months, fell before the arms of the French, and the Pope, returning from Gaeta, entered through the body. Let me start that again. Rome was bombarded, and after a heroic defense of 2 months, fell before the arms of the French, and the Pope, returning from Gaeta, entered through the riven walls of his capital, and over the slaughtered bodies of his subjects, to take possession once more of that chair which is mightier than the throne of kings. The head of the old confederacy being now lifted up, power returned to the limbs. The Bourbon of Naples came back to violate the constitution it had solemnly sworn to maintain, to deliver up Naples to the cruel rage and lust of his soldiers as a chastisement for the insolence of its inhabitants in driving him out, and by the unsparing exercise of a frightful tyranny, to fill with dungeons and doleful captives a land which nature has clothed with a dazzling beauty. By the orders of the same tyrant, Messina was besieged and left only when it had become a little closer than a mass of mingled ruins, blood, and corpses. The same scenes were enacted in most of the capitals of the principalities and dukedoms into which Italy then was portioned out. Radetzky and his Croats appeared on the Adige, and after a series of sanguinary conflicts, Lombardy was compelled again to submit to the yoke of Austria. Venice once more sat in fetters amid her glorious lagoons, all unconscious of her storied renown and utterly bereft of her traditional gaiety. There was no song upon her waters, and the voice of the harp was silent in her palaces. Milan upon her noble plain, and in the presence of her glorious Alps, sat silent and sunk, oppressed by an intolerable sense of shame and woe. Many of her sons had fallen by the saber of the Croat, others had been swept off to prison, and those who were left were in hourly danger of a similar fate. Padua, Ferrara, Bologna, whose names recall a past of glory, presented the same images of sorrow. The Austrian was their master. Their inhabitants trembled under the rod of the oppressor and walked in their streets more like corpses than living men. The passing traveler felt the prevalent and mysterious dread taking hold of him the moment he entered within their gates, and he made haste to depart, not without a touch of sorrow for the unhappy fate of those who would have gone with him, but could not. He passed on from city to city and from province to province to find that, quote, all joy was darkened, unquote, and that, quote, the mirth of the island was gone, unquote. Vienna itself, the proud capital of Austria, was bombarded, and after the massacre of her citizens and the conflagration of some of her palaces, was taken by the imperial troops. Then it might be seen, sitting silent and sullen by the queenly Danube, brooding over the barbarities, cruel and useless, which followed its capture. A war of races was excited in Hungary, which, after opening brilliantly and giving a deceitful promise of victory and independence, had, as everywhere else, for its issue submission. Thus the continent became a camp. Soldiers and sabers were seen everywhere, and Europe was compelled at the sword's point to return to her dungeon and yield her limbs to the old fetters. There was no loosening of these fetters, no intermission in the rain of fire which the sun poured upon men for 10 long years. We doubt whether another decade in the history of Europe could be found in which its people suffered so dreadfully day by day and from one year to another, from the exercise of a minute, searching and venomed, crushing tyranny. How appropriate the symbol, a rain of fire. That very authority which should have existed but to cherish and foster, studied only to make itself a curse to its subjects, and by its thousand myrmidons, myrmidons, and I looked that up too. That's a really interesting word. Yeah, by its thousand myrmidons to irritate and torment them. So the myrmidons are, I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Myrmidons are a follower or subordinate to a powerful person, typically one who is unscrupulous or carries out orders unquestioningly. Yes. To irritate and torment, yes. Okay, so in 1851, this reaction took a new start. Then was struck the coup d'état in France, and immediately thereafter, this symbolic sun attained the maximum of its burning power. The coup d'état consolidated the reaction. It produced upon the political stage of a new prodigy, or rather it advanced him to a higher position, for he had previously stood up. It brought forth a man of insoluble character and inscrutable thoughts, who, by some strange destiny, had come from exile and poverty to reign, not over France only, but in a sense over Europe. This man seemed to wield a mysterious influence over the revolution. He had power to bid it cease, to bring order out of the wild chaos that existed before his advent. The political elements recognized in his voice that of a master, and the nations quailing before him, laying down in their old chains. He swept off the legislative assembly to prison. He deported the citizens in thousands to Cayenne and threw the press into fetters, and served by an obsequious priesthood, a devoted army, and numberless trained bands of, here's another one, against arms and spies, okay, and the against arms, I probably mispronounced that too, didn't I? Yeah, they call it a gendarme. Gendarme is a heavy cavalryman of noble birth, primarily serving in the French army from the late Middle Ages to early modern period. So let's start that sentence again. He swept off the legislative assembly to prison. He deported the citizens in the thousands to Cayenne. He threw the press into fetters and served by an obsequious priesthood, a devoted army, and a numberless trained bands of Guisarmes. I just can't pronounce this word. Ugh. And spies. And he left only one willing acting in France, his own. This man became the center of the European coercion. All he did prospered. The fame of his sagacity rapidly grew, and his policy became the model on which the other kings fashioned theirs. Yes, they asked his counsel. They borrowed his aid. They courted his friendship. They were lifted up or cast down according as the exile of former years smiled or frowned upon them. This tyranny waxed fiercer and yet more fierce, for the wrongs of today must be supported by the greater wrongs of tomorrow. This was the case especially in Italy and Austria. The populations in these countries were decimated. They were bastinadoed, imprisoned, banished, shot. Commerce and agriculture were overwhelmed by oppressive taxation. Progress was arrested. Every aspiration for liberty was stifled, and a universal terror overspread the kingdoms. The sun of government shone not to nourish, but to scorch. The rulers of Rome and Naples enjoyed an unbelievable notoriety among these oppressors, but we refrain any detailed account of the deplorable condition of the papal and Neapolitan states, and of the frightful, and indeed to all save those who had an opportunity of witnessing them, incredible atrocities which were committed upon their inhabitants during this period. A statesman of our own, whose veracity is undoubted and his eloquence, has told us what he himself saw in the dungeons of Naples, where, as in those of Rome, some 30,000 men were incinerated. And it is not yet forgotten how the whole British nation was thrilled, shocked, and horrified by the revelation. Quote unquote, "I believe," said Lord Palmerston on June 14, 1852, quote, "there is no example of misgovernment or of cruelty, of legality, of violence, of abuse, of power, of every sort and kind equal to that which prevails at the present in the Neapolitan and Roman states," unquote. It is added emphatically, but affectionately, that the men who were thus fearfully scorched, quote, "blaspheme the name of God, who hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory," unquote. The judgment was not more awful than it was righteous and holy. It was sent to cast past sins into remembrance. It was sent to cast past sins to remembrance and to induce repentance for them, but it utterly failed to accomplish its end. The men, now so terribly smitten, had been the instruments of these very governments in the slaughter of the martyrs of Jesus. The tools were now made the victims. They were now, in the providence of God, compelled to suffer at the hands of their merciless oppressors all that variety of wrong which 300 years before they themselves had inflicted upon the disciples of the gospel. They had this reflection no further embittered the judgment, and it was themselves who had opened the way for this tyranny. If the champions of religion had not perished in the 16th century, the champions of liberty could not have been put down in the 19th. But the men of the popish world neither saw the hand of God in their punishment, nor understood the lesson he meant to teach them thereby. Nay, they, quote, "blasphemed the name of God who had power over these plagues," unquote. It is a historic fact that these awful calamities seemed but to confirm them in their atheism. Some took occasion from them to revile God's government and deny his being, while others were led to greater excesses in their idolatries, betaking themselves for help to gods of wood and stone. It is an instructive fact that this period was signalized by the proclamation of the crowning dogma of popery, the Immaculate Conception. Thus both the oppressor and the oppressed continued impotent, hardened, and blinded under the holy hand of God, and accordingly, the curtain is dropped upon this, the fourth act in the awful drama, with the emphatic announcement, quote, "They repented not to give him glory," unquote. And there ends the reading of chapter 21. So, Michael.
Gendarmerie.
Ooh.
Gendarmerie usually means police in French, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but but you were then speeding ahead, and so I did not want to intervene.
Right. Yeah, I could have asked, but I just thought I'd just keep going, because I thought this would be such a long session. I don't know, maybe it's not that long. I haven't looked at the time, but...
Yeah, you can also say the gendarme. Darme means armament, so the weapons, and Jean means a man or gentleman of weapons. So I think I had very, very unsatisfying French lessons in school, so therefore my French is very, very bad. But I guess that's what it comes to.
Sure. I'm trying to find where that was. I think that was quite a ways back. But no worries. Yeah.
Gendarme actually means this. It was a very famous and exclusive people on horses, actually, gendarmes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking it up in English, but it's not available in English, so I would have to translate it. But I guess everybody knows that there was some elite fighters. Let's put it this way.
Yes, that's right. Oh, yeah, that was that was a tough one. Some of those French words really throw me for a loop.
Yeah, if you are just been a little bit more used to their pronunciation, you actually remember something from memory, you see.
Right.
The gendarmerie, that you find on many, many, many police stations in France.
Right.
Just an old word.
Yes. Yeah, wow. But this is, if anything, this book is really a good history lesson. And I do appreciate it for that fact. The historical continuity with his exposition. But yeah, Michael, so any final comments? Should we close it up?
Yeah, you see that it's just not that easy to follow, but
no,
it's just quite contrary to the usual history lessons that we had in school. So therefore, I appreciate your efforts and thank you so much, and I'm glad to be here the next time.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you as well very much to accompany me on this, because it's kind of overwhelming to do it solo at some times. Other times it's a lot better too. So it just depends on the topic. But obviously, we're dealing with Europe, and this is, since I didn't grow up in Europe, I feel a little bit out of place. Let's just put it that way. But at any rate, I think it's, we can see the implications of these things on the whole world. And certainly it's an ongoing lesson. So hope to see everyone next time. Thanks for joining us. Catch you then. Bye-bye. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. We intend here to simply indicate in a few brief sentences who this lamb-like beast is, and then pass on to the grand catastrophe. It is the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which we take to be here symbolized. The vision brings the Pope again before us. In the beast of the sea, he is seen as the ruling head of the 10 papal kingdoms. Here he is beheld as the ruling head of the papal clergy. This beast rose out of the earth, the symbol of the Western Empire in its tranquilized state. He had 2 horns like a lamb. The key of the symbol is found in our Lord's warning, quote, "Beware of them that come to you in sheep's clothing," unquote. Such was the clothing in which the beast of the earth appeared, a circumstance which fixes upon him a clerical character. He is called, quote, "another beast," unquote. It has ever been the policy of the popes to keep their ecclesiastical distinct from their temporal kingdom. Their clergy have generally been exempt from the ordinary tribunals and taxes, and amenable in both respects to the Pope alone. Thus, the ecclesiastical state appeared before the world as, quote-unquote, "another beast." The 2 horns indicate we are disposed to think the 2 powerful organizations through which the ecclesiastical jurisdiction was wielded. The clergy of the Pope were divided into regular and secular. They were the 2 arms of his strength, bishops and priests. With the machinery of councils and synods, were a powerful instrumentality for executing the pontifical will, but an equally pliable and effective instrumentality for the same purpose did the Pope find in the numerous monkish orders which covered Europe. These were the 2 horns of the ecclesiastical beast.